I was here several years ago, and it was great. I remember, I don't remember all the faces. Some of you may have been here or not, but it was good. I got my PhD from Kansas, University of Kansas. I know in Missouri. I probably shouldn't say that, but my areas of philosophy are political philosophy, and I like the continental tradition the best. People like Heidegger, Gadamer, Habermas, people like that. Dr. Panza, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'm Chris Panza. Started at Drury in 2002. I got my PhD at University of Connecticut in 2002, and I wrote my original dissertation work on John Locke, who was an English philosopher from the 1600s. But subsequent to that, for the last almost 20 years now, I've worked exclusively on Chinese philosophy. So my specialization is mostly Confucianism and some Taoism. So that's my area.
All right. I think I'm starting, or I'm going to talk a little bit about good and evil, and why we're. I think that not good and evil is a problem, but that we've lost something here, and we're not really sure about what all this good and evil talk is all about. And then I'll let Chris go from there. If we look at the modern period of philosophy, roughly around the 17th and 18th century, 1600, 1700, philosophy changed, and and the sciences themselves changed. The sciences had a rather dramatic rise, very successful, and philosophy took a very different turn. It tied itself to the sciences a little bit more, and it became more critical in that, in the more positive sense. The word Kant talks about critique. So critical was trying to sort of clarify the foundations of things, find out what made sense and what didn't. And one of the areas, besides science and knowledge, was to talk about morality. And the idea with critique was to try and supply a foundation or justification for the moral judgments we make. When we say that this is good or this is evil, this is right, this is wrong, philosophers were trying to explain to us why we make these judgments. What are the reasons that tell us why something is right or wrong? And this critical stance, though, had this bad effect, because what it did was it undermined the traditional sources of morality. And, for example, tradition itself, this long tradition stretching back over thousands of years, as well as also eroding our confidence in religion to supply us with a sense of good and evil, right and wrong. And in fact, it led an 18th century philosopher by the name of Hume to argue that morality didn't really have an objective basis, that really its basis was in sentiment, so there's nothing really rational about it at all, unlike our judgments about facts, what's out there. These things could be determined by observation, trying to see whether they were true or false. But morality was something in here. Morality is something you felt. And so Hume had developed this idea that morality is nothing more than sentiment. It's not rational. And then this led to some attempts to try and fend off this judgment. So following Hume, his English followers, those that came after, decided, well, look, he may be right. Maybe it's something like pleasure. And these were the utilitarians. And but their attempt to try and frame a morality that was based on pleasure, maximizing pleasure, minimizing pain, and so forth, was plagued by a number of critical challenges, one of which, perhaps one of the most devastating, was determining how it was possible to derive an ethical judgment from a naturally occurring thing like pleasure. Pleasure, we know, happens to all of us, but it's not clear that it has that kind of ethical basis for it. So just as quickly as utilitarianism became this important tradition, criticism caught up with it, undermined it a great deal. A German by the name of Kant also tried to do this, except rather than talking about pleasure, Kant would talk about morality in terms of, well, what is it that we expect everybody to do? We have to ask ourselves, if I tell a lie and I get away with it, that's great for me, but what if everybody's doing it? if everybody's doing it, that would kind of make it difficult to live a little bit. And so Kant tried to give us some kind of rational way of sorting through our sense of morality so that we would know that those things that we could expect everybody to do would be what we want from that. But the problem with that kind of justification is it was a kind of empty formalism. Well, what happens if you could come up with the worst kind of action and give it a rule that you would expect everybody to follow? Some people think that inflicting pain on others is okay. What if everybody did that? The person might be willing to say, I'm okay with that. So if people are willing to say that, it turns out that what Kant has given us is a kind of empty, logical way of doing this, but without sort of telling us what kinds of actions would be ruled out by that. So, as we say, where utilitarianism couldn't explain how something naturally occurring like pleasure could provide anything like a moral direction to us, Kant's logical formalism also proved to be kind of empty because it couldn't specify what rules ultimately. So I think in the 19th century, as this is developing, the problem we have is Nietzsche comes along and he sees this problem for what it is. He says all these traditional sources of morality, we don't really take them that seriously anymore, or at least most people don't. And any rational kind of talk about it, it gets so abstract that we don't recognize what it means to live. And so Nietzsche, seeing this, he realizes that philosophy has kind of gotten away from the habit of everyday life. And so this kind of leads to this criticism he makes that you have to abandon good and evil. Because good and evil has its origins in something that we think we've turned against. So it could be religious or the tradition, the Western tradition that Plato and others have helped to conjure up. Nietzsche says we need to abandon that and we need to focus on ourselves and ask ourselves, wait a minute, where do we get the idea of what makes for a good life? And usually it's by being true to ourselves, true to the feelings that we have, and just expressing those things, much like an artist does. And so he has a very aesthetic way of trying to talk about morality and so forth. So he seems to have helped us in one sense. We can kind of step out of that formalism or that appeal to hedonism that had been going on. But in the end, Nietzsche himself really wasn't able to sort of tell us, okay, all these different things that people will be true to, how do we sort them out? Are there any good ways and bad ways? Are we going to just give up on good and evil? It's not clear that that worked out the way I think he would. He never really got around to giving us a kind of final account there. And if we think about it, over the last 100 years, we really haven't gone much further. We've had people like John Rawls, and he takes up the question of justice. He wants to try and find out if there are any rational principles, much like Kant, that will help us decide what makes a society just or not. And it's a pretty good argument. Sounds good. But the problem is that as you try to sort of sort through these cases about what makes a society just, Rawls's principles have a little bit of trouble sort of garnering the kind of consensus that you would require to run a democratic society. Then we've had MacIntyre, a fellow who says, well, look, we should turn back to a more classical understanding. Let's get back to the Greeks and the Romans. Let's talk about the virtues. And then also the Christian, the religious virtues. We should return to those. MacIntyre offers us a very, very clear account about how we might sort of restore some of that earlier confidence, but it's a very long walk to doing that. And so a lot of people don't see that as a practical opportunity. And then we've kind of had people recently who kind of celebrate Nietzsche. Richard Rorty, who passed away just a few years ago, but he had a kind of minimalist notion of morality. We should think about not causing cruelty to others, as well as trying to be our best selves and that sort of thing. But again, this minimalist morality doesn't seem to get us very far in establishing what a community of morality would have us to do. So philosophy has kind of, in its own way, been its worst enemy. Because the more we try to sort of think about this, we apply the cynical acids of critique, we wear out the fabric of social life. Kind of difficult to take it up again. I'm sure we all at some point wonder, all these people are shouting at each other with their ideas and so forth. You know, who's going to come along and make sense of it? And it would be great if religion could supply that, but if you look at our religious, the various religions that we have today, we have a lot of different groups out there yelling a lot of different things at each other. It's hard to figure out where you can kind of, it's one thing to say, well, look, I know what I believe, but at some point we need to be able to sort of reach agreement beyond ourselves, and that's kind of a tougher thing to do. I have, my last comment here is, for me there's been one kind of promising path, and that is to go back to the German philosopher Hegel. His point of departure was to think about the problem with Kant. Kant's empty formalism seemed to detach itself from the way in which we lived our lives. And it might be great for questions of justice, but it can be very abstract. Hegel noticed that it seemed to not capture very well how we think and talk in places like Oceola or Springfield or New York or Chicago. That people had their ethical life that they lived with, their communities, and the standards that those communities had. And Hegel wanted to sort of say, can we bring together something like Kant's moral thinking with something like looking at the local customs, the local moral fabric of towns and cities and so forth, and begin to think about what are these ties that people have in the places where they live? What brings them together? How do they face their struggles and problems? And while Hegel hasn't really, Hegel's not, there aren't a lot of philosophers today who are looking at that path. That seemed to me to be one path that we might take. But it's a long walk. It's a long way to sort of work these things out. And it's almost like we're way back to square one. However, turn it over to Dr. Panza. I think he has, Chris and I have been talking about this for some time now, and he has a rather interesting take on virtue and so forth. So I'll let him take over.
So Ted and I just taught a class together where we talked about, we used McIntyre, who Ted mentioned when he was speaking. So McIntyre, he's still alive today. He's retired from Notre Dame, I think. And McIntyre's thesis is that ethics, or living morally or living well, was the way of life that was that sort of embodied the good, was in the distant past, right? So the ancient Greeks, for me it would be the ancient Chinese as well, and that something happened, right? And that way of life has been disrupted, and science plays a pretty crucial role in that kind of dismembering of morality. And after the scientific revolution, things just start to fragment, right? Now, I just want to say a few things about that and then talk about virtue as the other alternative, right? So Ted left virtue out. So when I talk to students about this, I ask them, when you think of the scientific revolution, 1700s, and you go forward, and you think about the world, does the world have meaning? And in the beginning, they don't know exactly what I'm asking, right? But you just look at the world, what's in it, is meaning in the world? Or is it just something that you sort of project onto the world, right? So, I think this, I feel this, and you sort of project it out, right? Is it that, or is it already out there? And they overwhelmingly say, no, you project it out, right? Which is the very modern view, right? So if you think of the modern world, it's based on this notion that the world is really just a lot of atoms, right? It's just little tiny things that crash into each other, right? And the job of science is to explain when things crash into each other, what happens, what's the result, and that's just science. But there's no meaning or value out there to be found. It's really just mechanistic explanations about how things crash into each other, right? Basic mechanics in science. If you go back into the ancient world, that's not how they talk. So in the ancient world, everything has meaning in it. The world is imbued with meaning. They talk about how things crash into each other too, and their science is a little less developed, right? It's the ancient world. But they talk a lot about value and meaning. So in the ancient world, the key concept is harmony. In the modern world, harmony's gone because there's nothing to harmonize with. There's just a bunch of kind of, meaningless, valueless atoms. How do you harmonize with that? But in the ancient world, there's meaning out there, and you're meaningful, and there has to be a way to kind of pull the pieces together. Right? So the Chinese talk this way, Plato talks this way, there's talk about this a little bit in Aristotle, but harmony is the different notion of how to think about human life, your role in the world. In the modern world, there is no role in the world. There's just however it looks to you. You say tomato, I say tomato. Everybody has a different viewpoint. Nobody can say anybody else is wrong, right, about value, because there's no ultimate arbiter out in the world that can kind of test that out. When you get into the ancient world, they think there is, so it's a different view. So think of the ancient world and their focus on virtue as starting in the nature of the human, because that's always where it begins. In the modern world, after the scientific revolution, nobody believes in a human nature anymore. That's gone. And I mean that in the sense of, they believe in nature in the sense of you have a biological form, biologists study you, there are doctors who understand how you function, but that's all mechanistic stuff again. It's kind of like the atoms crashing into each other. But humans don't have a nature. They're not meant to move in a particular direction. Does that make sense? So a human life doesn't have a natural direction. In the ancient world, it does. So in the ancient world, human beings have a natural direction. It's called teleology. And what that means is, telos means goal, right? So in the ancient world, humans have a nature, and that nature is to go that way. Whatever that way is. That's the job of the ethicist, is to figure out how do you cultivate states of character, ways of being, ways of thinking, that kind of push you down that path and not down another. This is something that if you think of modern science, who talks that way now? Now you might believe that, but it's not rooted in science, right? Nobody says, well look, if you get to chapter 18 in the biology textbook, that's where they talk about human teleology. That's the chapter where they say, the human life is meant to go in this direction, and and the virtues or character states or whatever that you can cultivate that can help you to do that, that's in no biology textbook. It's in no psychology textbook, it's in no chemistry textbook. In the ancient world, it's not. So what does that look like? For a Confucian, and I like Confucius, he's a very attractive thinker for me. Confucius thinks that human nature is embedded in relationships. Now think of the modern world. Do we think of human nature as naturally belonging in relationships? We like relationships, that's a different question, but is our nature to be in a relationship? That's not really the modern, you might like it, but that's not the modern view. The modern view is, you're identical with this thing. This is all you need to be. Now, if I want to contract into a relationship or get married or something, that's fine. But my nature is complete here. Does that modern view make sense? I'm not saying you like it or dislike it, but does that intuition make sense? For the Confucian, you can't be complete as an individual. It's impossible. Your nature would never be complete because your teleology is meant to be inside of a unit. So what units? There's lots. There's the family. That's the primary unit. There are friends. There are communities. There are societies. There are governments. Whatever. There's varying different types of relationships you can be in. But for a Confucian, you cannot perfect yourself or become good unless you're inside of a relationship. And then, once in the relationship, you have to cultivate yourself so that the relationship moves in the direction of human teleology. So that's radically different from the modern world. Think of the modern world, they'll say, look, it's nice to be in a relationship, you feel good, maybe you get pleasure. So Ted was talking about this focus on pleasure, sensation, but that's not completion, that's just experiencing something. For the Confucian, that's where the good is. Its source is located inside those relationships. And they have to work a certain way. So let me just ask, how do you know a good relationship? Because this is a Confucian question, right? So you want to be good and not evil or bad. They don't use the word evil. Evil is is a different type term. They use bad though, right? Bad is a word that's used. It just means the opposite of good for them. So what does a bad relationship look like? Just give me some descriptors of bad relationship. Yeah.
So when you say good relationship,
Yeah.
what I've looked for is somebody who won't let me hide.
Okay. So like somebody who, well, hide in the sense of calls upon you to be for openness, something like that, like pulls you out. What do you mean by hide?
Whether it's my defects or
right.
I don't want to be all I can be or whatever, it's like,
Right,
oh, I can hide in
right.
this relationship. It's
Okay.
one that says, I'm here to find out more and
Nurturing.
And when I think
Developing.
when I look around, when
Yeah.
I was growing up, I looked
Yeah.
around and I saw a lot of relationships where people
Yeah.
just used each other to hide, and we can just
Sure.
do this whole day, and
Right,
we don't
right.
have to ever deal with anything.
Right.
And I'm not interested.
So there's no development, there's no
Right.
nurturing, right? So that's a very Confucian notion. So for a Confucian, a good relationship is one of reciprocal development, right? So the question now is, well, there are many relationships that don't do that, right? That's obvious, we all know those. Those relationships do not have virtuous people in them. Because virtue are the character states that you would develop that lead that dyad in that direction, right? So now what's a character state? What kind of character states do people need to have in relationships for them to be nurturing and developing? That's the next question for a Confucian. So, okay, nurturing and reciprocally developing relationships are the human good. Now, they will definitely say that about the family and about marriages and about your relationship with your children or your parents or whatever. But what kind of character traits do you need for that to happen? This is not something that you just turn on like a light switch, right? You don't go into a relationship and say, up until now, I've kind of been a bad person, not very nurturing, you know, I haven't been into mutual reciprocal development, but today, yes, click, just hit the flip the switch, and you're a nurturing, caring person. It doesn't work that way. So what personality or character traits do you need? Empathy.
Generosity,
Good. You need empathy, care, right? What else? Honesty, trust, loyalty, compassion. These are all character traits. So what will a Confucian say? If you read the Confucian text, it's a conversation between him and his students. And the conversation is about, well, how do I become this kind of person? So it's this constant discussion, well, you're going to need empathy. How do I get empathy, young master? What do I do? And it's this constant discussion about how to cultivate yourself. I mean, really, you think of yourself as kind of I always think of like a bonsai tree or something. So you're this tree that's kind of just growing all over the place. And as you learn, well, I need to be more empathetic, I need to be more caring, I need to be more loyal, I need to be more trusting. And you're kind of shaving the tree. And you're going, well, I got to stop those behaviors because that cultivates indifference, right? And not empathy. Snip, 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 right? Snip, snip, snip. And you keep doing this and you're shaping yourself into a virtuous person. So much of the conversation in virtue ethics is around a bunch of questions like, one, what's human nature? Is it to be in relationships? Confucius says yes. Somebody like Socrates talks a lot in Plato about the role of a person inside of a city. You know, a city is kind of your community, right? Confucius talks a little less about the community. He's more about like everyday, like your family, your wife, your husband, your children, your friends, right? Socrates is a little more focused on the relationship with the city at large, which is kind of like your larger community. So what kind of character, Socrates said, what kind of character traits do I need to be a good citizen? Because that's the notion of the human being, a little bit for him. But it's always that question. One, what's human nature? What's the teleology of that nature? Where is it directing all human beings towards? And then what are the virtues, the character traits, that push me in that direction? And then how do I get the virtues? What kinds of behaviors do I need to engage in to get there? Let me talk just for a minute also about what virtues are. So I always use this example with students. They like this example because my students are getting into their first relationships ever, right, or their first serious relationships. So I say, imagine that you go to a restaurant with your significant other, and it's your 1 year anniversary. These are all like 18 or 17 or something. And you're sitting across from your significant other, and your significant other says to you, you say to them, I'm so happy that we're in this relationship together. This relationship is so awesome. It's so great. what a awesome significant other you have been, and you're so loyal, right? You know, it's a great character trait to have in a relationship. And the significant other says, hold on a second. And of course you say, well, what do you mean? Hold on a second, right? Well, hold on. It's not that I've ever not cheated on you, because I never have, never. But I always think about it, like all day. I think about it, right? So my mind, my thoughts are always on cheating. When I see objects of, you know, of the other sex that pass me by, I see them as potential objects of cheating. So my vision is kind of working that way. My thoughts work that, my vision works that way. And my emotions work that way because, you know, I see the waiter or the waitress, you know, whatever it is, and I feel attraction to the wrong person, right? And I said, but worry not. I have a steely will, and I never give in. I've never cheated. Now, what would happen? So I asked myself, well, what would happen? And they're like, I would reach across the table. I'd stab that person with my fork or something. And I said, well, right, because you would say, that's not what loyalty is. What kind of concept of loyalty are you dealing with, right? So
But it's honesty.
Well, it's honest, right? But that's right. But the loyalty component. Think of loyalty. Is loyalty merely doing what you're supposed to do? A virtue ethicist will say no. Loyalty is not just doing what you're supposed to be doing, but thinking that way, seeing that way, and feeling that way. Everything is in alignment because the virtue ethicist says, what's a human being? Thought, perception, feeling, right? You know, Satet was talking about feelings. Some people try to, in modern ethics, make all of ethics about feelings, right? Do you feel pleasure or pain? The virtue ethicist says that's a component of you, feelings, but that's not all of you. Another component is thought. Another component is like perception, seeing, right? All those things have to be in alignment with what loyalty is. And then you naturally do the right thing, because if your thoughts, your perception, and your feeling are all aligned in the right direction, then why would you ever not do the right thing, right? That's the stuff that drives your action. So if you're thinking of the ancients, that's how they think. They think of ethics as really demanding, because that's hard. That's not just, well, I just got to make sure I don't ever give in. This is, you have to fundamentally transform everything about you so that your character, which is pretty thick here, right? Seeing, feeling, thinking, is all focused in the right direction of your natural teleology. And when you do that, you're in harmony with what's around you. Your significant other, your family, your children, your community members, the state, whatever. You're in natural harmony with them all. All the parts are synchronized. Modern ethics does not talk that way. It gives up on all of that, and ethics becomes very thin. Ancient, very thick, modern, very thin. Yeah?
In your example,
Yeah.
if instead of saying, no worries, I have a steely will,
Yeah.
you said, no worries, I know when I'm well off, would that change the equation?
When I'm well off, wait a minute. What does that mean?
Know when I'm well off? I know that you're the best option I have.
Oh, I see. So, no, I don't think it would, because here's what the virtue ethicist is saying. Well, they have a name for this. So here's the name. There's virtue, that's at the top, and that's when everything's in alignment. Everything about what it is, what you're feeling, you're thinking, blah, blah, blah.
Okay,
But next, and the next down, that's perfection, right? You'll never get there.
Yeah.
But the next down, they call continence. And continence is when I feel the opposing motions, but I keep them in line. And then incontinence is when I feel all those things and I give in, right? But on that point, they would say, is that the final pinnacle? So they're going to say, well, surely that's better than incontinence, right? That's better than giving in and saying, oh, the temptation's too great, what am I going to do? You're higher up than that, but the question now is, are you saying, well, that's loyalty? The virtuous would say, well, no.
Well, aren't we on a process?
Mhm.
A
Yes.
journey? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
you say, you
Yeah.
can't flip a switch and
You
be
can't.
there.
Right.
So, in whatever moment, you might
Yeah.
have this
Yes. Yeah.
onslaught of temptations.
Yes.
If you can't remind yourself that you're better off without giving in, then you're
Yes.
adrift.
Yeah, right. No, I agree. I'm saying, so on the bottom you would have vice, that's like the worst person ever, then incontinence, continence, and virtue. So you're saying somebody who's kind of in the continent area, right? They do the right thing, they feel some temptations, but they still do the right thing. But
not
there's another
because of
level above
will,
that.
But because of perception that their loyalty is
Valid.
better. Yeah, it's valid. It's life-giving to them, and their disloyalty would not be.
The virtuous would say, but is there a better state than that? I mean, that's their natural next
More
question.
of that is the better state.
Their natural next state for them would be, the next state is, you don't see temptation. You don't experience it. You've rooted it out. It's very much a self-perfection kind of way of thinking,
Yeah.
right? Now, they're not saying that you'll ever get to perfect sage or something like that, but they don't think that, but what they'll argue is,
Diminish it to the point where
Yes.
you don't notice it. but
yes,
it's
yeah.
still there.
Well, not don't notice it, but rather they would say you diminish it until the point in which it's no longer really there. I mean, there's actually component, no, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm more of a, not interested in maximizing
Yeah.
anything. I want to optimize things.
Right. Well, they're maximizers. So
Yeah.
no, they want to get to a different state and not just get to a point where it's good enough, right? And I think,
No, you don't get to a point and stop.
yeah. Well, that's what their question would be. That's why I'm saying, well, what's the next stage up? They're not going to say you're
More of the
bad.
same, only it's-
Get a little
the
better.
balance is
Get a little
changed,
better.
yes.
Right. And that's the key part. They're not saying that person's bad. What they're saying is that's not loyalty. Loyalty is a much fuller notion. So you see what I'm saying? They're not saying, oh, the person who holds it in and they're continent, that's a bad person. A bad person is a vicious person. That's the person at the bottom.
Doesn't care about
Or
it.
that person doesn't care, right? Yeah, the vicious person is the person who says, I seek out all opportunities and, on purpose, and I don't care, and I don't really care what it means. See, that's the bottom. Continence is fairly high up already. You've done a lot of work, but what the virtuosists would say is you don't say good enough, because there's still another level above that.
You never say good enough.
Right, good, and that's all they care about. That's all they care about. They would just say, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good, right? So there's always good places underneath perfection, but that doesn't mean you don't shoot for higher. But they have a very thick notion of the good. Modern ethics, I think, has a more thin notion of the good. It's not that demanding. But the notion here, though, is, and this is the key thing. So what is goodness? Goodness is not up to you. Goodness is up to your natural nature, right? You have a human nature. So it's not just a question of you deciding what the good is. And then the question is how good you can cultivate your character to travel in that direction. Right? And that's just a very different notion. But that notion, as Ted was discussing, is no longer in play. Right? So in the modern world, that's kind of
Because
been
humans have
devastating.
really evolved if they get there.
What's that?
I think the human race has really evolved if it gets to that state.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard state to get to, right? I mean, in the Confucian text and in Plato and Aristotle, they do not vision the community as being full of virtuous people, right? They do not. And Confucius tends to think that most people are actually pretty far down, right? They're optimists, they're idealists who at the same time are pessimists, if that makes sense. They realize, they're idealists in the sense that they think human nature can be perfected. But they're pessimists in the sense that they realize just how darn hard it is to engage in that kind of path and how few people make a lot of progress.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Isn't it, in truth, isn't it really the easier path?
Which path? The virtue path?
Yes.
Yeah.
Isn't it really, when all's said and done, isn't that the easy way?
They think it's actually incredibly hard.
Yeah, it may appear that way,
Yeah.
but in the big picture of things, it seems to me it's the easy way.
Well, I think they think,
because to chase pleasure, to no good end,
Yeah.
that's not an easy way to go.
Right. Well, it might lead to a lot of suffering,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean a lot of people don't pursue that path.
But it doesn't bring about any virtue. It doesn't.
No,
It doesn't
no.
bring out those things that you know in your being
Right.
at the end of your life when your time's done.
Right.
That you've been that person that's going in that good direction.
Sure. But do most people go down that road?
Yeah, well, I don't
Yeah,
know.
no, I think that's, so the Confucian would say it's actually in the immediacy of the moment. It's a lot easier to go the other way, right? It takes pretty difficult commitment to cultivate virtues, right? And that seems right. Now the question, when you cultivate virtues, do they get easier? Yes, I think they do say that. Because it becomes a habit like any other, right? I mean, it's like, years ago, I go to the gym a lot, right? Well, before I went to the gym, and this is a very Confucian, Aristotelian explanation, I would drive my car, park my car in front of the gym, but resist the whole thing the whole time. Get out of the car, look at the building, and just feel repulsion, right? It's like and my mind is racing about, oh, but don't I have papers to grade?
Where's the nearest cheeseburger?
Where's the nearest cheeseburger, right? So my mind is racing to come up with a reason to drive away. I feel repulsed. It looks like an ugly, heinous building. I'm gonna feel pain when I go in there. Who wants to do this, right? That's the immediacy of trying to change habit. But then what happens 4 months later? When you go every day, right, and you put up with it. Then you go up and you park and you look and you see this building and like the birds are chirping, right? And you're like, oh, it's gonna feel so great in there. I love this place. It's the most well architecturally designed building I've ever seen. Then it's the opposite. It's very easy. But that's a different notion of is it easy, right? Because it requires a whole lot of getting through that initial stage to get there. But once you get there, it's not hard. Right? So I think that's the
Thanks.
yeah.
When he's talking about it being the easier route, I think of my growing up that it was watching my sister get in trouble, and it was easier to do what I was supposed to do.
Right.
But I don't hear you saying that is following the path. What I hear you saying is that, yeah, that's the easiest thing to do, but really following the path is integrating that
Yes.
to where I want to do
Yes,
that instead of doing that to kiss somebody's butt.
Exactly. No,
And
it's exactly
the
right.
easy thing to do is to
Yeah.
kiss butt. The hard thing to do is
to transform
to
yourself.
believe that.
Right,
yes.
right. No, it's exactly right. So Aristotle says you have to do the right thing for the right reasons.
Right.
And that's a crucial component of virtue. Confucius calls people who don't do it for the right reasons, he has a nickname for them. It's they're the thieves of virtue, he calls them. And he says that these are the people in the community that you have the most to worry about. This is a really interesting claim. He says the vicious people you don't really have to worry so much about because you can spot them. Right? You know exactly where they are, and you can point your finger at them and say, you are blameworthy for this reason, and this reason, because their behavior is very obvious, right? He says the thief of virtue, not so. He says the thief of virtue is doing it for societal reasons. They want to kind of free ride, in a way, if that makes sense, on the community's value, and act virtuously, even though they're really doing it just because they want people to like them, or they want to get the social benefits of acting virtuously, but internally it's completely selfish. He says those people deconstruct virtue in their local communities, but you can't point at them. What do you say? He says, so you go, internally, there's nothing identifiable. So he says those people are actually the most dangerous, the ones who mimic virtue, because you can't point anything out. Vicious people, it's easy. It's so. But it's an interesting, I'm trying to contrast with what Ted was talking about. In modern ethics, there just is no notion of human beings are kind of pulled together by a natural path in a particular direction. Teleology is seen as an ancient way of talking. It doesn't make sense to modern people. So in the modern world, ethics focuses on very different things. It's not human nature. It focuses on things like pain and pleasure. Or it focuses on agreements.
Yeah, self-interest.
Right, self-interest, things like that. People coming together out of their self-interest and making contracts that we agree to and we keep our promises. It's not based on human nature because we don't really believe there is one. People will say things like, well, you live that way, I live somewhere another way. Who's to say, right? Who's to say was not a phrase in ancient China. It's just, it wouldn't make any sense. There's a human nature and there's a way in which you cultivate yourself to become a good person. Yeah.
Would you define teleology again? I've
Yeah,
not
so
heard
just
that before.
no, it's okay. It's a Greek word. It just means, ology is just like the study of. Telos means aim. So it means like direction. So if I say, well, what is the so when I talk about teleology to students, I use, because Aristotle uses the metaphor, because he thinks everything has a teleology. Everything. Plants, animals, everything. Remember I said everything has a meaning. Everything has a teleology. So it's how does everything's teleology work together. But in class, what I do is I explain it using plants. So you remember years ago we had that ice storm? I don't remember what year it was. We had that really bad ice storm. So
2007.
2007. So I would drive by, it was this huge willow tree, right? And before, it was just beautiful, beautiful, full-grown, very old willow tree. And then the ice storm happened, and like half of the tree was dead. And the other parts, it was like there was dead branches, and it was lying over. So I said to the students, I said, well, everybody's had this kind of experience, right? Where you see a plant or a tree or something that looks beautiful or looks ugly. I said, what are you naming? Aristotle would say, and I think Confucians would too, that the full-grown willow tree has grown into its telos, right? It was meant to be this full-grown thing, and you're responding to it. When you see it, you recognize the full actualization of its purpose. And when it is half dead, or and there's dead branches in it, you respond like with repulsion. You're like, ugh, that's not its nature. Something's happened to it. It's been twisted, right? That kind of response is very natural to us, right? So students get that. They go, yeah, no, I've seen rose bushes. We're like, oh my God, look at that rose bush, how full it is, right? Well, why does full matter? And Aristotelian would say, well, it's kind of in a way drawing on your sort of natural appreciation for forms out there, right? And you're kind of like picking it up or something. The natural telos of the rose bush, right? Sometimes it's jacked up and ugly because its human nature is not being exemplified, and sometimes it is. Use that, and now just think of human beings. We have no problem talking about plants that way today. So if I say, boy, doesn't that willow tree look really jacked up and ugly? You'll say, yes. Right? You have no problem saying that. You do think in a way that it has a kind of natural form, and it's not really exemplifying it. Something happened to it. And if I look at a human life and say, look at that jacked up human life, you might agree, but you'll say, well, that's just kind of the way I see things, though. You know what I mean? You'll shift out, and you'll start talking about it as if it's a subjective thing, not a natural thing. In the ancient world, they think human beings are no different than bushes, right? There are jacked up human beings who have not cultivated their nature, and there are beautiful human beings, those are good human beings, who have cultivated their nature. So the question then just becomes, what's your nature? In the modern world, that's not the question. In the ancient world, it's, what is it? Is it relationships? Is it being a good citizen? Like Taoists, the ancient Taoists, they think it's not being in a relationship or being in a community, but rather being a part of the natural world. Like, well, how do I do that? How do I harmonize with the natural world? But they've all got an answer to what is human nature, beauty, and then the question is, how do I cultivate beauty in myself? And it's not my subjective opinion, that's my form, kind of like a rose bush or a willow. Does that make sense? Thick view. And since the scientific revolution, nobody believes in that. So people like McIntyre say, well, we're kind of adrift, right, in the modern world, because we've lost that notion of teleology. So now we think of good and bad in terms of like causing pain or something. And the Confucians would say, and the Aristotelians would say, well, it's not that pain feels good, it surely does not, but isn't pain part of the process of self-beautification? I don't think they would have a problem with that. They would say, well, that's part of the process of becoming virtuous. Right? It's nothing bad with it, there's nothing wrong with it. And it's not simply an idea of making agreements. Right? Some agreements are awful agreements. I mean, there's nothing natural about an agreement. But there is something natural about the human form. Right? So it's a deep conversation, virtuotics. Yeah.
How do you think that can help us now?
Now, I think it can, in the sense that I think people. This is just my own view. I'm just departing from Confucius. And I see this in students. Right. So when I teach ethics, I see that students have they're not developed because I haven't thought about them, but they have an undercurrent of intuition about virtue. What I see in the modern world and this is McIntyrean, a failure to be able to develop a language to talk about common problems, right? We're all in like islands, right? Because we've bought into this notion that everything is highly subjective, What you think, what I think, you say tomato, I say tomato. Everything is highly relativist, everything's highly like isolated and individualist. But yet, if there's an undercurrent of intuition that people tap into and have a sense for, like something like virtue, something like relationships, something like human beauty, that's the kind of foundation for a conversation about human direction and about communities. So think of a community. What's a good community? Well, that's either going to be a conversation about human flourishing and beauty, or it's just going to be a bunch of people talking about what they like, right? So if it's a conversation, well, I like this, I like that, well, let's take a vote. That's very modern, but it's very subjective. But what if the conversation is about flourishing, about the human form? Now, I'm not saying that here's the way it'll turn out, but that's a very different conversation that people have intuitions about, I think. I just see it year after year when I teach it. And I think that, here's my guess, is that people have that intuition partly because they're raised in families. And what is a family? But a good family, I mean, they're crappy families, but a good family is a family that's rooted in this kind of way of talking, right? About character traits, about human history. You think of yourself as part of a historical kind of tradition, and I'm cultivating a certain kind of way of living, right? It's not subjectivist. And I think family structures, on a level, kind of maintain this intuition about virtues and the importance of human form. And we can extend that. Now, that's what Confucius says. You can take that and extend that out to your friendships, extend that out to your marriages, to your community relationships, and so on.
Okay.
But you've got to give up
Yeah.
on the subjective component.
Yeah, I was just going to add to because your question came. I
Yeah.
wanted to make this comment, and then your question came. About 25 years ago, when I first showed up at Drury, there was a political scientist by the name of Robert Putnam, and he wrote you know this Bowling Alone, and one of the things he's talked about
that's
was
Yeah.
all of these local.
Yeah, they've fallen apart. Right?
Yeah, they've fallen apart. So,
Right.
quilting clubs,
Right.
you know, bowling leagues, you know, now
Right.
everybody's doing things on their own,
Right.
and so forth, you know.
Everybody's on Facebook.
Everybody's on Facebook, yeah. And so he was talking about how we see this sort of withering away of these very informal civic associations and so forth. It's an idea he got from Tocqueville, who also talks about this. But if you think about it, like, you know, here everybody is gathered together. Tom brings people together to hear lectures like this. These are the kinds of activities that help us to sort of get in touch with each other, to help us begin to talk about those things that we really do share in common, because it is clear, we all have differences. We all have interests that distinguish us as human beings. But what we seem to have forgotten, we have just as many common interests. So many things that really would unite us. And it's here at this local level that we expect those connections to be made. And so Putnam wants to talk about what it would take, like you know, if he were asked, you know, if a young student came to him and said, well, what should I do? He'd say, go and join the Rotary Club, right? And stick with it. And, you know, because he goes, the average age of all these organizations and so forth is like 65, and they're getting older every year, and many of these things are dying out. He goes, here's how you sort of help to maintain them and keep them going and maintain that sense of connection. And that sense of flourishing, because it encourages the conversation, arises in that. Right? And we understand what it means to be not a bunch of strands, not just individually, but put together in a rope and become very strong by that.
Let me pick up on Ted's point. So another way to think of expanding that point a little bit is think of democracy, right? So, you know, I think today a lot of people are talking about, well, what's the strength of our democracy? Is it stronger? Is it weaker? Democracies have, in my view, two pieces. One piece is very kind of procedural, right? So all of us have a bunch of rights. We have the right to political participation. We have the right to vote. We have the right to access to legal counsel, but lots of rights, right? Rights belong to individuals, right? That has a place in a democracy for sure, because that, in a way, is the thing that allows you to feel safe, right? But can a democracy exist simply on that? I think a virtuous would say, no way, right? Because a democracy has to evolve, because it's full of people who are in particular situations with particular histories. That has to evolve, right? Well, how do you get that? if people are too focused on the part of democracy that has to do with rights and protections and what they're owed and all that sort of thing, there's no conversations, there's just protections. So what Ted's talking about is, and Tocqueville talks about this, right? Doesn't a democracy require strong, thick, local connection where people come together, not because they have rights or any of this other thing, because they need to have conversations about flourishing. They need to have a conversation about human beauty. Like, where is it? What is it? How has it changed? Because history is moving, right? So for a democracy to be flourishing and vibrant, it needs to constantly bring people together. But you're never going to bring people together simply on the terms of how they're different, right? Those are the things you have to navigate. You have to pull people together on the virtue of their sameness, and then figure out their differences and navigate those things going forward. So I think that's the other thing, is if you lose too much sight of the importance of human form, human teleology, human beauty, you're left with just kind of empty formal systems. And Ted was talking about this with Kant, or Rawls, where you just have procedures for everything, and that's it, right? Well, that's kind of democracy. It just becomes an empty formalism with a lot of rights, but it's a stagnant system that's not going anywhere. So that's, I think, the thing. The more I feel like I have something in common with my friends and my community members, the more I want to talk to them. And when we talk, we want to talk about, how to come together and build things and move forward. But that requires a faith in virtue, a faith in commonality, right? And also, I think, a respect for differences, right? But you can't have that unless you have the foundation that holds you together in the first place. So, somebody like McIntyre would say, we've lost that ground.
Yeah.
We don't believe in it anymore. Science has told us that we're just a bunch of atoms floating around. So all we have left are protections and differences, and we're afraid of differences because we don't believe we have any commonalities anymore. So that's a problem.
Yeah. I was just going to say, good and evil, we kind of come back to that. Good and evil for Nietzsche was based on this fear, right? We had to have ways of dividing things up, the world up, people up, and this sort of thing. So if we want to get beyond good and evil, beyond living by a kind of fear of those things that are different from us, we have to somehow cultivate a way, either a return to where we can reach out, make connections with each other, be together, flourish, or develop a new way of talking about these things where we can actually achieve these things. It's got to be one or the other, but the current, Nietzsche's attack on morality is that it was based on fear. It made us servile, it made us afraid of each other, it limited us. And I don't think he sees the initial sources of that, whether it's in religion or in Plato or wherever, as initially having that kind of thing, but it had sort of hardened into that. And if you look at the way we are with each other today, it really is, we approach each other with a lot of fear. And you could be the smartest person in the world, the most open person, you're going to be afraid of something or someone, and you're going to find yourself reacting to that without even noticing it, without even realizing it. And so having these appropriate kinds of connections to each other help remind us of our humanity. It gives everybody dignity, and it helps us to sort of connect to others in a much better fashion. A healthier fashion, I would think.
That was a big answer.
Yeah, so I'm sorry about that, yeah.
Okay, an example of what you're talking about might be the tradition of the Vermont town meeting. People get together yearly in the community, and they're speaking on a trust basis rather than a fear basis.
Right.
And they are considering what's best for that community.
Yeah. Right.
Bernie Sanders is the tip of the iceberg in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
Beneath him, there's a whole thriving culture that we have no idea of here,
Right.
where we live.
Can I just say, Tocqueville thinks the New England township is the model with exactly this kind of meeting together. He lays out in detail, by the way, the 2 volumes of Democracy in America, the first volume just deals with America, with its democratic system. And he begins from the bottom and works his way up. The New England Township is the model. Unfortunately, the further away you get from New England, the more that, the weaker that model is, right? But he would agree with you about that. That's Alexi de Tocqueville. He would agree with you that this Vermont Township is exactly the model, because he talks about how the people would get together to talk about schools and about roads and how they were going to plan these things, and they worked in coordination with each other. Everybody understood the point and the purpose. You know, in Springfield, we always have these ballot measures. We need a 1/4-cent sales tax. There's always a group of people saying, why do we need this, right? And I'm thinking, well, we drive on the same roads. That should be pretty apparent. But the thing is we don't all meet together and we don't hear what each other is saying about this. But not in Vermont, right? There's a kind of consensus there. You're right. It's something that we don't know about. And by the way, going back to Confucius, going back to Plato and Aristotle, Athens, these towns were not huge metropolises. These were, I think Athens at the most would have been 500,000, but these were places where you could at least have some personal meeting, right? Where you weren't isolated from each other. And so again, it's not unlike the Vermont style of township meeting.
Well, I think we ought to quit now, and we thank Professor Vaggalis and Professor Panza for their presentation. I might say we have some dessert on the table for those who want dessert, and we also have a short tour of the building for those who are interested in that. And the tour will meet in the hall there in 5 minutes.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you. It's our pleasure. So thank you.